All right, so good morning. I hope you had a nice weekend. So we're starting this morning with Greg Mckenna, who spoke last week. So today he'll talk about the study of aging and rejuvenation in glass formers.
Okay, so I hope everybody's recovered from the forced march to Mysore yesterday. I managed to avoid that. I just went downtown. But what I'm going to talk to you today has to do with structural recovery, but now its effect on in my case, I'm going to be looking at the mechanical properties, but in fact, it also has an effect on things like dielectric properties and so forth. And I'm also going to then talk about rejuvenation, which has to do with the coupling between large mechanical deformations and the underlying structure of the glass. In addition, along the way, I'm going to take a look at some aspects of things that understanding aging allows me to ask other questions, okay? And I'll show you what those are as I go along. So, as I just indicated, structural recovery is, of course, the evolution of the non-equilibrium state, such as volume or enthalpy, which we call the structure of the glass, towards equilibrium. And then physical aging is the response of the mechanical or other, as I said, dielectric property to the changing structure of the glass. So there's a slight subtlety. Some people call structural recovery aging, but in fact, the physical aging is the response to these changes in state, if you like. So I just told you what that is, what aging is. And aging has been known, physical aging has been known certainly by the 1960s, if not earlier, and polymers. And it was the seminal book by Struck in 1978 that's called Physical Aging in Polymers and Other Amorphous Materials that gave the first successful, really quantitative look at the problem. And I'll use some of Struck's data as I go through what I'm doing. So remind you of our sort of default figure 1 here. As we come from a supercooled liquid, or in many cases polymers, it's the equilibrium liquid state. As we cool, at some point we deviate from the equilibrium line, and that's what we call the glass transition. If we sit isothermally, and this is the most common aging experiment as the structure recovers, what we want to do is try and understand what, at each point along the way, what's the change in, say, the viscoelastic response, okay? And it's really important because what we're trying to do here is take a snapshot of what the instantaneous structure of the glass is doing to the mechanical properties. And that way we're using the mechanical properties as a probe of the structure. And to do this, Struck actually proposed a methodology for doing it, and then he justified it, okay? The proposed methodology is you do your quench, and then at some time, aging time, now this is TE, you'll see a lot of people in this community use TW for waiting time. Struck used the term TE for elapsed time. And this elapsed time, the first one, he would have it be, let's say, an hour. And then he would put a mechanical stress or strain on the sample, and then he'd hold it. So he's doing a stress relaxation or a creep experiment. But he always holds that this TI is always less than 10% of the waiting time, or aging time, or elapsed time. Okay? And the reason for that is because you don't want whatever the structural recovery is doing. Remember, the density is changing in the material, or the enthalpy is changing in the material. You don't want it to distort the response that you're looking at as you look at the mechanical response. An extreme case, for example, is if I do a uniaxial extension experiment, I can pull on a sample, and people have actually misinterpreted this in the literature, but they pull on a sample, and they watch it relax for a while, and then the volume eventually catches up with what's going on, and the sample starts trying to shrink, and you get a stress that relaxes and then starts increasing again. And that's an artifact of the incorrect methodology that those particular people use. Now, normally, I do most of my experiments in shear. It's less of a problem. But even so, you still have a changing dynamics as you go on in time, and that will still distort the apparent relaxation response if you're not careful. So the second thing is then he would wait, again, at least a factor of 10 So like if you did, I'm sorry, not a factor of 10, a factor of 2 here, and so that makes this distance from here to here 9 times this time, so that you don't want this particular mechanical solicitation affecting this mechanical measurement. If you couldn't do this, then what you'd find is you had to run all your experiments individually, and it would just take a lot longer to do your experiments because you have to run individual tests instead of running these all at once. So we're going to do an experiment. We quench, we wait, we do an experiment. So we wait an hour, we do a 6-minute experiment. We wait then to a total of 2 hours, then we do an experiment for 12 minutes, and so forth. 4 hours, 8 hours, and so on. It's a logarithmic time scale. And here's the justification for Strzok's protocol. This is the volume departure from equilibrium here versus log time. And you recall I showed this structural recovery behavior. And Strzok said, I want to take a snapshot, basically. So this time has to be short relative to this time, and you don't want this changing structure affecting what you're trying to take a picture of. Okay, so that's the general idea. And these are equally spaced. You can see they take up always sort of 10% of the logarithmic time. Yeah?
Is it similar to stress relieving in castings or metal alloys?
Is this similar to what?
The metal castings in metallurgy?
I honestly don't know. I don't know. I don't know what that is even. So. So then when you do that, then here's the response. This is a polyvinyl chloride glass that was quenched from about 10 degrees above the glass transition to about 40 degrees below the glass transition. And what you see is that here's the creep response. So this is load is applied to the sample, and this is the strain basically divided by the load. And you can see that as we go to longer and longer aging times, these things shift, so the material is getting stiffer. The other thing that Strzok found was that he can essentially perform aging time superposition to create a master curve with small vertical shifts. He needed small vertical shifts. Sometimes you need those, sometimes you don't. But he needed small vertical shifts. And you can see how long this is going on. This is a 1,000-day experiment. Okay? So very long experiments. And we know now that this, of course, goes on, if you're at low enough temperatures, it goes on for more than 1,000 days, right? So, but that's a 3-year or so experiment almost. So now this time temperature shifting, then you can define a shift factor, an A sub TE, because he called it elapsed time, that then you'll find how that behaves. So let's define the shift factor. So this is some typical data. This is our data for an epoxy glass. And here's what happens in many cases is that you'll find your shifting goes on something that looks like a power law. When I plot the log of the aging time shift factor versus log of the aging time, I'll find myself in a power law regime. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute. But, and he found that the slope varied depending on the polymer, depending on the temperature, from any, if you don't have any aging, it's 0 at the glass transition. And when you go lower, it increases to some maximum value and then comes back down to a lower value. Very seldom was it ever 1, okay, which a lot of people look for a value of 1. The other thing you can see here is when I age at 5 degrees or 10 degrees below the glass transition, you can actually see it coming into equilibrium. Okay, just like, of course, the volume does, right? The volume comes into equilibrium, so you see that this is coming into equilibrium. This is the shift factor. This is the aging time. The shift factor is defined, it's really the relaxation time normalized to a reference relaxation time. Okay, so if you like, it's a scaled relaxation time. Okay. And this just shows, this is polycarbonate, it just shows that depending on the temperature, my shift factor can depend quite a bit on temperature. This obviously is closer to TG than, I'm sorry, this is way below TG, and this is actually in the region where it goes through a maximum. It's almost 1. Okay, so as we talk about time, aging time superposition, then, as in the case of structural recovery, when I talked about, the relaxation time depends on the instantaneous structure of the glass. Okay, and that's the assumption. Otherwise, you don't make that time, aging time superposition caveat, but remember, there's a measure of the structure of the glass, and it could be enthalpy, it could be volume, it could be, if you could be more complete, maybe including some internal ordering parameter. In my case, I'm going to usually use the surrogate of volume, because that's what we measure. And then we can define this aging time shift factor, as I did graphically. Aging time shift factor is just the tau at some aging time divided by the tau at some reference aging time. And you either take it as your first test or your last test. It doesn't really make any difference. It just shifts the curves, right? And then we define a shift rate. So it's the slope of the curve. Mu is d log A TE d log TE, which means it's d log tau d log TE. Okay, so that's the slope of that curve. And so this just shows what it looks like as a function of temperature. And this is a small strain regime. It also turns out it's a function of the magnitude of the deformation of your experiment. So you do have to be a little careful to make sure you're in the linear regime and the small deformation regime, or you seem to have an effect here of the magnitude of the deformation. And this just shows what it might look like. This is for polycarbonate. This would be the WLF response of the polycarbonate. And what we see is, because the material fell out of equilibrium, we see that in this case, at 17.5 hours of aging time, it comes like this and deviates. And one of the challenges is ultimately what people want to know is, does this really go up if I wait long enough to the extrapolation of the WLF or Vogel-Fulcher behavior? And I'll come back to that in a moment. So before that, I want to take into account here some issues related to elapsed time theory or the power law evolution during aging. And the question is why. And I put that star there to say that this whole thing is only valid in the down jump experiment to write things this way. Okay, when you do more complicated histories, obviously the elapsed time theory itself, according to the full-blown version, is valid, but when you're doing it, when you're looking at, say, shear melting in a colloid, it can only be something equivalent to this down jump experiment, because everything goes always in one direction. But should you have a power law? That's the question. So, well, I wrote this down yesterday for the, I actually wrote it for volume, but you can write it for enthalpy as well. And we know that it accounts for these kinds of behaviors. And this is my reduced time. And then if I want to write the creep compliance as a function of aging time, then, in fact, it should be a function of time and delta. It's a function of the structure of the glass. Or in this case, I put it as a departure, but I could put that as fictive temperature as well, which changes as a function of the aging time. And then you would write it like this. So it's a function of reduced time, where J is the creep compliance. And if you wrote it as a simple KWW function, it would look like that. Okay? Where is what coming from? This is just an assumption. This is how you write time temperature or time aging time superposition. Okay, so this is a reduced time idea in viscoelasticity. So if I had time temperature superposition, I would just put an A sub T in there instead of an A sub delta. Okay, and that's how the linear viscoelasticity community would write this equation. Okay. I'm sorry?
I'm not seeing something. So, I mean, that's a specific form.
This?
That two-time dependence, right?
Well, this tells me, okay, this is a specific form of the dependence of J on the structure of the glass. It assumes that time structure superposition is correct. And we actually observe that it's at least a very good approximation to correct. Okay? So, I mean, it's an assumption, but it's an observation that seems to hold very well. And I'm going to show some data from Struck in a moment that shows that it's actually a very good approximation. But I do this, and if I do the elapsed time, I write it this way. But in fact, I should write it this way. It should not be, it's really a function of the reference. It should be a function of some internal parameter in the glass, which has to do with the structure. And I write volume here, or no, actually it's enthalpy in this case, but it could be volume or some other internal ordering parameter, or all considerations of that non-equilibrium thermodynamic state. And when I do that, then I have to imagine some limits, because I didn't feel like doing this calculation. I just needed to imagine some limits to ask what it's going to do. So what I did was I say, okay, let's take this sort of Fogel-Fulcher equilibrium line, nominal equilibrium line, and then I'm going to take the material and I'm going to do an infinite rate quench. So that's the fastest relaxation time I can have, is one that corresponds actually to this high temperature. And then what's going to happen is the material is going to age this way. Okay? And I'm not even going to concern myself with what happens per se in between, although of course I could say I have an estimate of what the times are there. And when I did that, just semi-quantitatively, well, you can see that you get a log of the relaxation time. You get a short one, and it's going to age. It's not going to age at all because it's going to be stuck for a while. And then what it's going to do is we're going to get into a power law regime. And then we know it's going to, at very long times, it's going to come over. So it really has this sigmoidal thing. And when Struck wrote down his elapsed time for these down jump experiments, he knew that, and he just said, well, in this regime, I actually have this power law-like behavior, which is just simply an artifact, in a sense, of the way in which I do the experiments. I simply cannot do the experiment at this short a time. You know, those would get to be very short times. And I tend, when I do my experiments, not to do them for such long times. You know, this would be 10 to the 10 seconds. That would be a long time. But you saw when I was close to TG, I was actually able to do them to capture this part of the curve. So, you know, I was able to verify that part quite readily. And that's certainly obvious why that should happen in such glasses.
In principle, if there's a divergence temperature, you do this below, then it will be possible.
Yes. Well, I mean, if it were a divergent temperature, then it would just keep going, right? Right. But in a system where you finite relaxation time, then you have to come to that relaxation time, right? Now, how about other histories? This is really the key to understanding this. And how about those other histories? Does it really depend on the structure of the glass? And so Struck actually did a series of experiments. He did asymmetries. He did memory. And this just shows the memory where he's showing the specific volume, just like I showed you yesterday in those two-step temperature jumps. And here he's showing the shift factor as now it's going to be the negative of the relaxation time, log of the relaxation time in this case. And as the volume goes up qualitatively, so does the mechanical relaxation time. Okay, so that's actually very nice. So how about quantitatively? So Struck did this whole series of experiments, and you see if we plot the log of these shift factors as a function of the specific volume, okay, they fall pretty much on a single line for these down jumps, down jump and then up jump. And here he doesn't show the asymmetry, but the asymmetry also falls into that category. So what we see is that the relaxation time depends on the departure from equilibrium, not on the elapsed time. And that's really important for structural glasses. And it's a challenge for, my comment is simply, it's a challenge for the colloidal community to come up with an equivalent ordering parameter to the structure so we understand what it means when you do a shear melting. Because in fact, the structural parameter might be something like, let's say, concentration. Or it might be some state of disorder which we don't understand yet, right? And so I think that's an important thing. And then you could imagine, though, experiments where you try to do something like this, but now with a colloid, okay? Okay, so now I'm going to show you that we get the same thing with the plasticizer jumps, just like we saw qualitatively. And this leads to an understanding that even in the plasticizer jump case, even though the rates of relaxation are not the same in the structural recovery, okay, I still get aging time superposition or time structure superposition, even though the structures seem to be different. Okay, so the details of the structure don't seem to be what's determining this time structure superposition, but they do determine the magnitude of the relaxation times. Okay. So this just shows the equipment. This shows how we're going to do it. In this case, we do some creep where we do follow the struct protocol, and here's what the creep and then recovery part will look like, and then we continue to do that. We'll do time.
Last comment, repeat that again because I guess
About the plasticizer jumps?
no. So you said even though something doesn't depend
Oh,
structure, but relaxation.
no, the structural recovery depends in detail on whether or not I went from a temperature route or a concentration route, the Kovacs type of experiment. But so we qualitatively get everything the same, but in spite of the differences between the, let's say, humidity jump experiment and the temperature jump experiment in terms of the instantaneous rates, it turns out that the mechanical response seems to follow the within the class of the humidity jump experiments, the mechanical, you'll see this, the mechanical response follows time, structure, superposition, but it's a different structure than what we had with the temperature glass. Well, you'll see what I mean. Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's very subtle because, I mean, it was something that was very unexpected for us, too. So there's something subtle in the structure of the glass that we don't understand. So this just shows we can do different jumps to carbon dioxide pressure here, so we're doing pressure jumps. So we get a plasticizer jump experiment, we get physical aging, we get time aging time, and time pressure superposition. I don't have to go over this, but this just reiterates the shift rate issue. I think this just shows the time aging time superposition. But the big thing here is the comparison of the relaxation time versus log of the aging time for the two conditions. One is a temperature jump, and the other is a carbon dioxide jump. Now, at this point, we haven't looked at the structure yet. We just looked at the aging time. Okay, so we want to look at the structure. But it's still very surprising that the carbon dioxide jump, which we know has a higher volume after we do it, we know at least that much, is still relaxing more slowly and evolving at a different rate. Okay? And this was similar to what we saw with the relative humidity jumps, where the structure, even though it had a higher free volume, if you like, was relaxing more slowly than the temperature jump experiment. So these are the behaviors after relative humidity jumps. We did it at different relative humidity, so you get time humidity superposition. And then we do, this is the intrinsic isopiastic, so we do a down jump in from 90% to 60% relative humidity at 60 degrees centigrade for this material. And you see this looks sort of like the intrinsic isopiastics. Okay, so we get down to whatever the shift factor is. And in this case, we're getting straight lines. So that's like we would get with the temperature in this regime. And we show that we get an asymmetry of approach for the 2 to 15% relative humidity jumps up and down, or up and down. So we get somewhat of an asymmetry. It's not as asymmetric as what we got in the temperature jumps. We saw that before. And we get the memory effect in the mechanical response as well. So this would show that if you just blindly applied elapsed time and expected a power law for this history, you wouldn't get it, right? So that's just the point of that. And these are these two-step histories. And this is the one step downwards where you do, of course, get something close to a power law until it starts relaxing towards.
So just to slow you down.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
So in the last lecture, what you showed were typically single time quantities. So you looked at the volume as a function of aging time.
Right.
So describe the Kovacs.
Right.
So here, instead of single time quantities, for each elapsed time, you're looking at a response curve.
I'm looking at a relaxation time, right? Right.
And so you're calculating a local relaxation time.
Right.
So it's the local relaxation time which you're characterizing with this shift factor A.
Right. That's right.
In comparison with a reference relaxation.
That's correct. That's absolutely correct. Yeah. So of course we don't think of it that way, but it's the time and then the aging time are the two times that Sri's talking about, right? And then this just shows, just like Struck found with his volume measurements after temperature jumps, we find that after these different memory, asymmetry, and, oops, isopiastic should be a T on that, as a function of the volume departure from equilibrium in this case, we find everything falls. Oops, there's some points down here too. I guess you probably can't see them. But we get everything falling pretty much on a single line. So again, yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. I'll show that in the next slide. So the slope, as you that was a fixed. I've rigged the audience for the question, you know. So here's the slope for the temperature jump at 50% relative humidity, and you can see it's very high. It's relaxing quite quickly, whereas here it's much slower, a lower slope. And you can also see the relaxation times, for the mechanical relaxation times, are longer even at the same departure from equilibrium. Okay, so well, yeah, it depends on it depends on the choice of the condition. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, because the carbon dioxide jump, they were like a factor of like 6 different, right? Yeah. So it's going to depend on the details, right? Now, one thing is that these go through 0, so they cross. So when I have a negative volume, then the humidity jump is relaxing faster than the temperature jump. Okay, so there's a cross in behavior, which we really don't understand. I think it's something that needs to be worked on more. And then I just want to point out that, of course, it's not this kind of behavior. Not the humidity behavior because we haven't done it, but this kind of aging behavior is well known in small molecule glasses as well, and this just shows some results we have from sucrose benzoate. So you get aging time superposition to create a master curve, okay, with a slope, and we find that it gets to equilibrium when we're close enough to the glass transition. So all glass formers show this kind of behavior when we're in the right conditions. Okay, so it's not unique to polymers by any stretch. Okay, so now I sort of understand aging understand it at least phenomenologically. I understand aging in the linear viscoelastic regime. So it suggests maybe I can use this understanding to carry out some experiments to test ideas. Okay, so one of the ideas that we were interested in testing was this issue of non-divergent dynamics. And do we really follow, if we age the material into equilibrium below the DSC sort of glass transition, okay, the conventional one, do we get to, does the aging curve shift upwards to the Vogel-Fulcher line, or does it go somewhere else? Okay, because this is actually a question that people have been asking, and we actually did this work back in 1999. And so what we want to know is, do the dynamics reach this extrapolated Vogel-Fulcher line? So as I indicated, what we're going to try and do is we're going to be down here somewhere, as low as we can go and still be able to get into equilibrium. Of course, if we follow this line, it's going to be a really long time before we get into equilibrium. Okay? So we're going to do this and see how far we can get. Okay? So we do these aging time superposition, and we get a master curve, just so we know we have that kind of behavior. We also do aging into equilibrium at different temperatures. The TG of this material is around 140 degrees centigrade, roughly. Since the first aging time is somewhere around a half hour, it's already aged into equilibrium, so it doesn't age. And now we're going to watch what this response is now as a function. They're in equilibrium. They're not changing. We're now in equilibrium. We want to know if, as we go down in temperature, whether or not this falls onto the WLF curve or Vogel-Fulcher curve or not. So this is just the time, temperature, equilibrium master curves. And here's the behavior we see. Here's the log of that shift factor versus temperature. And this is how people in the polymer community do it, so we do it versus temperature. Here's the Arrhenius type plot, so you can see where we're limited enough temperature range that it doesn't make any difference. This is an equilibrium line. This is the equilibrium line. This is the extrapolated Vogel-Fulcher behavior for that material. So what we see is, at least, the equilibrium relaxation times as shift factors, or if you like, as reduced relaxation times, do not follow this diverging curve. Yeah.
So when you say those are equilibrium lines, these are...
Yeah, so I mean, is this simply telling me that there is a deviation from Fogel-Fulcher?
Yeah.
But I mean, in principle, this you can also see above the glass transition temperature.
In some instances, J.B. Dyer has just written a big article saying we see this everywhere, you know, above the glass transition. So, I mean, really, my comment on this is sort of that we probably have, depending on the material, we have a, if you did a Stickle plot, you'd have a Arrhenius, some sort of Fogel-Fulcher-like behavior, and then a higher temperature Arrhenius and maybe some other things. But apparently at this, in this temperature regime, we're falling off of that divergence. So we have this non-diverging behavior that he talks about more recently in his Nature Physics paper.
But do you have cases where the Fogel-Fulcher continues to be valid, and then what do you expect to see?
If the Fogel-Fulcher continued to be valid, and Ranko-Richert claims that for polyvinyl acetate, that's the case, so there may be some subtle events that have to do with when this is going to take place. But in that case, this would come up to here. Now, that's going to be hard to measure, right? I mean, that's really the real issue. In this case, we picked a polymer that got into equilibrium fast enough that we could actually look at the divergence compared to the actual measured equilibrium time scale.
Right. No, so, I mean, because you posed the question of whether the shift factor would eventually reach the relaxation times of the liquid by extrapolation, right?
Yeah.
And so the answer from this graph is negative, but is it negative because the extrapolation is not valid, or if there is something else surprising? That distinction I want you to
Well,
make.
clearly the extrapolation of the Fogel-Fulcher curve for this material is invalid. For sure. Yeah, because this wouldn't fit the Fogel-Fulcher curve, right? Yeah. So for this material, it's invalid. Now,
What are those other points then? Those are also measured points, right?
no, these are just the temperatures that the student did the fit at, you know, for the Fogel-Fulcher, right? So these aren't points. These are data. These are not data. Those are numerical points, right? Those are just numerical points from the Fogel-Fulcher extrapolation, right? And then here's some other data that I took that Cindy Simon and her students did, where they were actually looking now at the log of the reduced viscosity or shift time, or reduced time. And now this is a Fogel-Fulcher plot. If it's a Fogel-Fulcher plot, this 1,000 over t minus t infinity, then it should be a straight line forever. And she just went back and found some of her own data and also other data from the literature that people hadn't interpreted. And what you find then is that, in fact, there's other evidence, and this is going way below the Fogel-Fulcher line again, too. So, in fact, what you find is that there's other examples in the literature of deviations from Fogel-Fulcher. Hence, the interpretation is that at least Fogel-Fulcher breaks down. If there's a divergence, of course, these are still limited temperature regimes. This is a limited temperature regime. It's conceivable that this just represents some other divergence that there's no way I can measure that, okay? But it's important to know that we can do this experiment, and if you're patient, you can do these experiments and find out whether or not the material will fall into that regime. Now, we've tried to do this with some small molecule glass formers, and we keep running out of liquid nitrogen, so we can't age them in the equilibrium, right?
Those fits still depend on what you choose as T infinity. So you take one part of the data, you say it fits Fogel-Fulcher with a certain T infinity, but if you take the experimental data beyond that, you find that doesn't work. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I can't, I mean, yeah, I mean, obviously, this depends on the T infinity that you choose, but if you want to have even close to a reasonable range of where you think things are fitting your data without making it too narrow, it's not that issue, right? But again, it's only in this case, it's only a 20-degree temperature range, right? I could probably fit a Fogel-Fulcher through that, right? But it does continue onwards, right? Yeah. Okay, so that's the linear response. And now let's take a look at the nonlinear behavior, or what this regime, some people think of it as where we're rejuvenating the glass. Yeah. Oh, sure. I'll be glad to take some questions. Sure. Before we get to the, okay, so we'll go back to that one then. So if we have any questions about the, yeah.
How confident are you that you reach the same state with this aging experiment as you would if you could with a very slow quench?
If you do it, you do get to the same place.
Okay.
Yeah. And people have shown that, actually. Yeah. Rob?
Edge of where you could go. Sorry. So everything was working fine up to the edge of where you could go, and you go just a little bit further, and suddenly it doesn't work anymore. I guess, is that, should I be surprised, or if you did a different system, would you be able to go a lot further before it didn't work anymore, or?
Well, I mean, yeah. Oops, let me. You want me to go out here?
No, I'm thinking that you have a TK from a lot of data, and everything is working fine, and then you have just a little bit more data, one more decade, and suddenly everything is working terribly. And it seems strange that it was just on the edge of the old limit of the experiments that everything stops working in a sort of sudden way.
Well,
Or not.
no, I think it's like I said, because, you know, if you look at Jippy Deer's results, okay, and Sri asked about this, even above TG, you find this crossover. And if you really go back in the old literature, people said this Fogel-Fulcher only really works from about TG plus 10 to TG plus 100 or something. And so there's already hints in the literature. And in fact, it's really interesting because, you know, we started doing this work, and there were multiple reasons. One is it had been on my mind for a long time because I was at a meeting one time in New Orleans, and Austin Angel came up to me and said, what do you think about this crossover to Arrhenius behavior just above TG? I said, well, I don't know anything about it. So and so other than what I just told you about, people thought that you were TG plus 10 and that might be related. And so we did it this way, where we had a sample that looked like maybe it was going on to, you know, follows Fogel-Fulcher up to around TG, but in fact, then we just had to go below TG. And had we gone into the literature instead of just running experiments, then we would have found what Jippy Deer did, and that is that you really have this transition over to the Arrhenius type behavior well before, well, you know, 10 degrees or 20 degrees before you get to the nominal glass transition.
So if you plotted the whole data on one curve, would you see a kink where you're saying that something happens, or does it just go smoothly?
No, you never get kinks. Life doesn't.
It's just as smooth. I mean, you could fit one function through it if you wanted.
It's gonna. I mean, it's gonna be coming up like this, and then.
Okay, so then there's a. Okay.
Yeah.
No, I guess, I mean, at a data fitting level, one can ask if I restrict the data range up to some lowest temperature, and I estimate a divergence temperature from that data set, and I move to lower and lower temperatures, how the divergence temperature varies. Is this something that has been done systematically?
I haven't done that. You know, people have looked at, I mean, Fogel-Fulcher, that's why Stickle did the Stickle plot, right? And Fogel-Fulcher is known to not really fit the data.
Right.
Okay, but it fits in ranges, and if you change the range, that's your question. If you change the range, it fits with different parameters, right?
Exactly. So
you know, but this is this kind of thing is a pretty severe breakdown compared to that kind of behavior. People still fit. Of course, you still fit with a Fogel-Fulcher. So then you wind up with, it depends on now how you define TG, how far T infinity is. But yeah, if I can fit this, because I said, this is Fogel-Fulcher will fit a straight line. and it'll fit something, and it'll pick something up. And like I said, maybe it's diverging at 3 Kelvin, you know,
right.
or at 100 Kelvin, right?
Right. No, so what's not clear is that if it's departing from a Fogel-Fulcher fit, the data, then you don't jump to the conclusion that it's going back to Arrhenius, right? So there's
Well,
a lot of
except
other
this is this is a
possibilities.
pretty good straight line, but yeah.
Well, in
No,
that range.
you're absolutely right. But it's consistent with the idea that there's no need for a diverging length scale, or at least not one that's diverging so rapidly that you have this. Yeah.
Is it absolutely sure that at Tg plus 10 you are still in equilibrium? I mean,
Yeah.
could it be possible that some measure gives you the impression that you're in equilibrium, but then when you look, if you could, into more subtle things, you would realize that there's some non-equilibrium thing hidden?
Well, okay, so let's imagine that this is not at the equilibrium mechanics response. Okay? Then, it's somewhere out here maybe, it has to do this, right? and I suppose there's no reason to say, oh, it absolutely cannot do that, because that's being a little hard. But the fact is, it's in equilibrium for a decade of time. And so that suggests that really it's very close to the true equilibrium response, not going to do that, right? Because that's what it has to do to get back to here. It has to go up, look how many decades here. It has to go up 4 decades in time. So that implies a pretty big error anyway.
You mentioned that what you want to use is not aging time, but an appropriate structural parameter. Do you get absolutely the same behavior no matter what measure of structure you use? I mean, you used volume or enthalpy, but what about local, internal arrangements that don't really change volume much? I mean, related to what?
Yeah, Takeshi and I were talking about that over dinner the other night, and it's a true question. People seem to find in polymers, at least, and in selenium, that the mechanical response and the volumetric response seem to track reasonably well. The enthalpy response seems to have a different response time. Okay, so this goes back to that question: am I really in equilibrium? All I can say is that I'm at a place where the mechanical response, in this experiment, I didn't do the dilatometry. In this experiment, all I know is that, in fact, the mechanical response has achieved a constant value, which I have interpreted as equilibrium. Okay.
Just one small question. Can we take this set of measurements as saying, look, why don't you forget about Vogel-Fulcher, do an Arrhenius plot, you will see a regime where it's not quite Arrhenius, and then eventually at low enough temperatures Arrhenius, and that is a better rendition of what's going on than saying that there's some Vogel-Fulcher and then there isn't.
Well, that's sort of, I mean, you can do that, or you can do the Stickle plot. And the thing about the Stickle plot, it makes the Arrhenius regime be a flat line. Mm-hmm. Okay, so then it's pretty clear, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so now we'll go from we understand perfectly the linear regime. Now we'll go to the nonlinear regime. And the question is, first question is, what are the effects of large stresses on aging behavior, okay? And I'll show you what we call the rejuvenation or erasure hypothesis. And I'm going to provide evidence against rejuvenation as hypothesized by others. We didn't hypothesize it that way. I'm going to also talk about some work in the literature that was interpreted in terms of rejuvenation. And I'm going to argue that it gives evidence of a nonlinear memory effect. Then I'm going to try to interpret this body of data. And then I'm going to also give some evidence of some interesting results, if I have time, that have to do with post-yield behavior. Because I really have tried to do my work generally below the yield point, because when you go above the yield point, it's way too complicated. Okay? The yield point? Okay, the yield point is generally where when you do a stress strain curve, it goes up and does something like that. It goes to a maximum in the true stress generally. Okay? And sometimes it's associated with shear banding and other things that I just didn't want to deal with, right? Okay, so, and one reason why I got involved with this was because of this paper by Utz, Di Benedetti, and Stillinger, where they talked about aging and rejuvenation in glasses. And this, you'll know, it was in 2000. I guess we all get sensitive about not getting cited, you know. And, and it turns out that Kovacs and I, back in 1984 or 5, so I don't remember when, we talked about large stresses actually erase partially or completely the effect of previous aging, thus rejuvenates the glass. And so we actually used the word. And we know how it became popular. Thor Smith from IBM visited Strasbourg about the time we were doing this, and he loved the term rejuvenation, and he popularized it, okay? So what do they mean by rejuvenation or erasure? So Strzok had seen that if I do experiments at small stresses that I showed you, we get aging time superposition, and there's a shift factor that looks something like this, an aging time shift factor. And he also found when he did big stresses, he would see two things. One is that big stress response would shift to shorter times. So you'd have a stress-induced shift to shorter times, which is consistent with an ironing type idea. But he also found that if I did, let's say this was 1 hour and 10-hour aging times, when he did the same thing in large stresses, he found that, in fact, the shift factor was smaller. And he interpreted that to mean, well, okay, and this just shows the shift factors as a function of applied stress that we work with. So again, this is a log of the shift factor versus aging time. Again, in this down jump sort of power law regime. And you see that the slope or the shift rate gets smaller as I increase the stress. And that's a signature, so-called signature of rejuvenation. And this was one of the hypotheses for what happens. Okay, so this is actually an important question, right? What are you doing to the glass when you put a mechanical deformation on it? And so here's what was stated. This is after Rico and Smith. And what they said was, okay, I'm getting this physical aging or structural recovery going on. And when I put a stress on, I'm de-aging the sample right back up the same line. So I'm changing the structure of the glass as if I had just started the quench over again. So that was the original meaning that people put to rejuvenation. And Strzok had another interpretation. This is adapted from his plot. I just put it in terms of total volume. He did it in terms of free volume. But here would be the normal structural recovery after a quench. And he said, well, when I'm putting my mechanical deformation on, I'm putting in mechanical energy, and that's rejuvenating the material. And so it shouldn't, as I load and unload it, it should not come back to the same baseline because I, quote, rejuvenated the material or erased the previous aging. So we're going to test this. We're going to do it in two ways. First, we're going to look at the equilibration time as a function of stress, or at least the onset of equilibration time as a function of stress in our epoxies. And then we're going to do torsional dilatometry to directly look at the measurement of the structure. We could also think about doing torsional calorimetry, but you know, torsional dilatometry is hard enough. Okay, so anyway, so here's the equilibration time as a function of stress. And remember, if we're close enough to TG, yeah.
There's been some discussion about different applied, global quantities that can take you across a structural arrest point, right? So here, I mean, so when you decrease the temperature below the glass transition temperature, you're aging, but by applying external stress, you're sort of kicking it back up in some other direction, not necessarily.
Well, yeah, that's
direction.
exactly right. Yeah, but so, I'm telling you what the hypotheses were at the time we did this work, and then I'll show you our interpretation, which actually looks sort of like a modified jamming fixture, except we didn't call it that. Right? Okay. Okay. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But so here was the idea: was that the rejuvenation, if you really had this rejuvenation, at least the signature of it would be that if I age it into equilibrium, and this is a schematic, and we don't never get that. But if we go to a higher stress, it's going to go to a lower place, okay? And it's going to take longer because I've rejuvenated it. The other possibility is at that time, there was somebody at RPI, Sandy Sternstein, who was arguing, in fact, in spite of that lower shift rate, I'm actually accelerating the aging, in which case T star 2 would be smaller than T star 1. So we had to test that hypothesis too. And then, of course, the possibility that you're not really rejuvenating the glass, and your mechanical stimulus is not directly impacting the underlying structure of the glass. And so we want to look at this, this question. So the first one we did was just the agent into equilibrium, or close to equilibrium, and we just defined it this way. And as a function of the stress, we don't seem to have a significant effect on the time it's taking to get into equilibrium. So that was our first evidence that perhaps what we have is something else. We don't have erasure of the prior aging. We must have something else happening. Okay? So that was the first evidence. But of course, this is sort of kludgy as a way to look at things. And so we really wanted a direct measurement of a thermodynamic type variable, which would be the volume. And so we designed a torsional dilatometer. And you know what the dilatometer is, right? It's something to measure volume. Okay? And what we wanted to do is we wanted to do the mechanical measurements and the volume measurements simultaneously. Now, if you remember the structural recovery behavior, we were only looking at strains of something like, or volume changes of something like 10 to the minus 3, 2 to 3 times 10 to the minus 3. Well, if I do a mechanical measurement in tension, the Poisson's effect in that tension, if the Poisson's ratio is 0.3, that means that for a 3% strain, I'll get a 1% volume change. That'll be way too big to then try to do what I'm doing. In other words, you'd be trying to take a small difference between big numbers and then interpret it. So what we decided to do was go to torsion. If you do torsion, volume changes are second order effects. So we expected those to be small, and we would be able to then sort out the underlying volume behavior from the mechanically induced volume behavior. So that's what we did. Here's the device. We have a motor back here, a sample here that's hooked onto a load cell, so we can actually measure the torque and the normal force. This is a metal chamber that is sealed, so we can evacuate it. It's heated to a 1 millikelvin temperature control bath. And then what we do is we fill it with mercury. We don't do much of that anymore, mercury stuff, but anyway, we could do it then. So we fill it with mercury, and then what we're going to do is we're going to twist the sample and watch the mercury go up a capillary with a LVDT with a float, so it floats on the surface of the mercury. And we can measure submicron displacements of the capillary. And so then the question is, how well do we do? Well, of course, what is the first thing you think of when you think of mercury in a capillary? It's a thermometer. So in fact, that's the reason why we need this good temperature control. And when we get done, the fact is long time, because of the volume changes primarily in the mercury, we're limited to 20 times 10 to the minus 6 long-term resolution or stability in the volume change, so 20 parts per million. However, instantaneously, in the mechanics part, we can twist the sample in like less than a second. So we can twist it, and instantaneously, we could actually measure 0.1 part per million in the volume due to the mechanics, okay? So now what we're going to do is we're going to ask what happens if I compare the volume recovery after a temperature jump when I do either twist and untwist, or I don't do twist and untwist. Well, the next graph shows it. You can't see very much difference except you see these big spikes. So those big spikes are the volume change due to the mechanics. Okay, they're second order, so they're actually quite big. We were quite surprised. We didn't expect to see that big a change, but we did. And then here's the underlying volume recovery where you can't distinguish the two. So in fact, this was, at least for this particular set of experiments we ran close to the glass transition and so forth, we see that there's no evidence of a delayed volume recovery due to the applied mechanical deformation. So this argued against a simple rejuvenation hypothesis or simple erasure hypothesis. Okay. Now, there were some other experiments in the literature that had to do with superposition of small deformations on top of large ones. Okay, because people are saying it's the large deformation that kicks you back towards the freshly quenched state. And they were, of course, doing experiments too, and this is the kind of experiment that got done. Some people call it a tickle experiment. So what you're going to do is you put a big deformation on the sample and hold it, so it's a large deformation stress relaxation experiment. And then you put a small strain on it and a small strain, and you're watching these stresses relax so you can get an incremental modulus. Okay? And so this protocol looks just like the Struck protocol after a temperature quench, but this is after, if you like, a mechanical quench. Okay? And then we're going to ask what happens. So here's what people saw and interpreted as rejuvenation. If you put here's your linear viscoelastic response modulus, and when I put a large deformation on it, and I don't actually remember, it's like 5% strain in polymethyl methacrylate, what we find is that it shifts to shorter times and then moves outwards. Okay? So it looks like it's been rejuvenated, and then aging starts over again. Okay, that was the interpretation that was done. Now we said we think this is a very complicated experiment because we know a lot about viscoelasticity. So we actually solved a nonlinear viscoelastic constitutive law to see sort of what you might expect in this kind of experiment. And I'm not going to go through the details of it, but it comes out of nonlinear viscoelasticity. And again, another two-time function. So we get the incremental modulus at time and aging time after we put the big strain on. It's just defined as this delta sigma over delta gamma, so the incremental modulus. And there's three terms. First, let's talk about these terms. So this is the linear viscoelastic modulus at time t, and that's after the time after I put the big, not the big deformation on, but the tickle deformation on. So that's the time after I put the small deformation on. Minus the linear viscoelastic modulus at t plus the aging time, which of course is basically at the aging time. So that's a long time. So it's a viscoelastic model. And so this number is always smaller than this number. So that's the first thing. So I'll always have a reduction of this from this. The other thing is this term is a tangent modulus. So if I go up to 4% strain and my stress strain curve is looking like this, it's the tangent modulus. Okay? So that's also always smaller than this number. Okay? Now it's evaluated at the same argument here, but so it's also always smaller than that. So in fact, what I'm always going to have is g at t minus something. Okay? So that's always going to happen. And then if I go to infinite time, if it's a fluid model, these two terms go to 0. If I go to infinite aging time, these two terms go to 0, and I'm left, I get back to my linear viscoelastic response. So that's very nice. And so we did some calculations, and actually we got very surprised. The first thing is that we didn't predict this at all. We actually underpredicted it. So in fact, the reason we say it's a complicated problem is without knowing the nonlinear constitutive law that describes your material, you can't interpret this experiment. Because if I interpreted it relative to the linear constitutive law, I would say I rejuvenated it. If I interpret it relative to this nonlinear constitutive law, I actually accelerated aging, made it stronger, and so on. So we just simply said that this is something you can't, when you do too complicated an experiment without having the right set of rules, you just really can't interpret them. So that's really the bottom line on that. Okay. We measured it. Phi prime, we were able to measure that. Because it's just an isochronal modulus. We had to run experiments up to those strains, but then once you do that strain, you know the modulus. Okay, so phi prime is measurable, yeah, directly. Without doing that experiment, we do a series of single-step stress relaxation experiments. Okay, so then there were some other experiments that Struck had done where he was aging the sample. So this is the aging before he puts a big deformation on, and then he goes backwards, and he called that rejuvenation. And this has the same problems as the other one, and we were able to quantitatively capture that, but I don't want to go over it. It's just too complicated. But ultimately, the question we need is some sort of interpretation about this nominal rejuvenation hypothesis. So the rejuvenation hypothesis, if I imagine I'm on this volume temperature plane, and then somewhere out here, some really complicated stress and stress history axis, so it's really a mess, actually. But I chose to do it like it was elastic. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to quench in this plane, so at 0 stress, and then I'm going to let it age or recover down to point B. And then I put a big stress on it. Okay. Well, if I were in just putting a big stress on it, has a thermodynamics out here due to the stress, right? But the question is, whatever's going on out here after that, when I unload the sample, is it essentially going back to here where I've rejuvenated it, or is it essentially going back to here where I haven't rejuvenated it? And our interpretation is that it's essentially going back to here, meaning that what's going on out here is essentially decoupled from this. Okay? Now, there's been some work now with computer simulations and energy landscapes that Dan Lax has done, and close to TG where we did our experiments, he's more or less in agreement with this picture. As you get to other conditions, you get different results. Okay? The thing that he does find, however, is that from his energy landscape picture, the mechanical rejuvenation part changes the landscape differently than if I had done a temperature jump. Okay, so maybe in that sense it's much like the humidity jumps in that I get to a different glassy structure. Okay, so, but anyway, this is how we were looking at it at the time, and I think that these pictures evolved a little bit, but this really means that erasure and rejuvenation, as originally postulated back in the 80s and 90s, is really not quite the correct picture. Yeah.
This picture must depend on magnitude of this stress.
Oh, absolutely.
So if you go close to yielding point.
Well, this is fairly close to yield, but if you get beyond yield, yeah, that's why I said I love to work below yield. Yield is just a lot more complicated, right? Yeah. In fact, I'm going to show you a bit of complication now. We didn't do the dilatometry in yield because then we would have had to take out the sample, and it took a week to load a sample. So, but here's the post-yield behavior. Does it give evidence for polymorphism? Yeah.
So the below yield is locally when you apply the stress, it's responding elastically.
Does not respond elastically. It responds viscoelastically, non-linearly viscoelastically.
Yield means what?
Okay, so I'm going to show you a picture of yield. Here's a picture of yield. Okay, so this is some experiments, again, on the same old epoxy we like to work with. And this is some work I did with Christian Gazelle in Nancy in France. And here's the experiment. You're going to run up at a low rate, and when the sample gets to yield, then he increases the rate so he can get 2 data points out of one test. Okay, that's the reason for that. If I run up directly, it does the same thing. But here's yield. It goes up, goes to a maximum, and then comes down. And some materials will go up. Some materials will continue to go down, depending on the material, if it strain hardens or strain softens. But this is, in this case, the yield was associated with some shear banding. Okay, so it's an instability. And we were interested in knowing how this ages, so you can see it ages. And we were interested in that. But, I'm sorry?
In this linear part, where is the viscous part of the response?
Okay, if I unload this, if I come up here, well, yeah, but this is just very fast. So let me take and do, I guess I have to use this. I'll show you number 1, huh? Or is it 2? Oh, 2. I got to have a blank page here. So when I do nonlinear viscoelasticity, is it writing? Oh, I have to have that. Okay. Then if I plot, if I'm going to do a plot the log of the modulus versus log time, and now at different strains. Okay, so let's say this is 1.001 to 0.01 strain. If I go to higher strains, it's going to do something like that. So this might be 0.04. And so forth, 0.08. And when my material yields, then in fact, it's just going to drop through the roof, right? Or through the basement in this case. But so that's what we mean by nonlinear viscoelasticity. I mean, basically. Now, the thing is, you know, when you do linear viscoelasticity, you can apply Boltzmann superposition. Boltzmann doesn't work here, okay? And there's really a whole range of arguments that people have and a whole family of nonlinear constitutive models, none of which actually captures all the nonlinearity. And some of the arguments arise, are there heterogeneities that actually mean that continuum mechanics just can't describe this kind of behavior? And I tend to fall into that camp. I really think that probably continuum mechanics, we're going to have to use it for a long time to come, but the ultimate solutions are not going to come out of the continuum view of the universe, okay? So that's, but right now we need to use them to get a framework, right? And they do have powerful predictions that can be useful to understanding, such as memory effects and so on, okay? Yeah, I got to go back. Where's that? Okay, thank you. I probably would have figured it out by myself. Okay, so this is what yield looks like. What we did then was we decided to do a set of experiments where what we're going to do is we're going to watch that yield stress build up as a function of aging time after a thermal quench, and then we're going to compare it with an experiment where we take and we go, in this case, to 50%. Now, these are shearing experiments. These are really elegant experiments that Christian Gazelle designed. And we can unload it, so you shear it and unload it back just enough so that when you get back to zero, you're at zero stress. And then we're going to take and we're going to run it up and take a look at this behavior. As a function of time after we did this first cycle, we just want to watch and see what happens to the yield stress. Okay? Ideally, you would think that if I did a quench and this one is aged into equilibrium, it should age all the way to there as it goes back to equilibrium. And that's certainly what we expected. However, that's not what we found. Okay? So what we found is the yield stress in the temperature quench sample, or what we call the non-cycled samples, versus the one where we did the cycle and then watch the yield stress go up. What we see is the rate at which it seems to recover towards wherever it's going seems to be about the same. Certainly a linear log plot it is. But where it levels off, now we could go out further, try and go out further. There's always a question when we stop these experiments. But it certainly seems to be stopping at a different place. So this is why the yield, and some people actually treat yield as a phase transition. Whether you like that or not is a different question. But this looks like we've come to a place where the mechanical response is different in the two cases. And it's not just a little bit different, it's quite a bit different. So we were very surprised, and the question we asked was, well, is there some sort of polyamorphic kind of transition here between one amorphous state and another? And we do know that if I take and heat this back up, it'll come back to this one if I age it properly. Right? Yep.
How sure are you that your sample remains homogeneous?
Yeah, we actually watch it, and this cycling experiment, you can actually watch. When you get here, in the case of the way he does the shear, is there's a groove in a sample to localize the shear, and you actually watch a shear zone, has a different index of refraction, it propagates the whole width of the sample. And so you can see that. So it appears, at least at the optical level, homogeneous. But I can't say anything about what's happening microscopically. Right? Okay? But the thing is that regardless, whatever it's aging, it's going somewhere else. And it certainly looks homogeneous at the visual level. Okay? So, but yeah, those are all questions to be answered in the future, right? Okay, and the last thing on this mechanical part is this implosion event to show how complicated these interactions are. Now I'm going to take a material far below the glass transition. Generally, I've been working near the glass transition so I can work and get into equilibrium sometimes, okay, because that's where we're interested. We're interested in complicated thermal histories and getting memory effects and so on. But this is a polycarbonate 120 degrees below the glass transition temperature. And this just shows the modulus. Oh, this is what I was showing you. Here's the modulus as a function of strain. So you can see the modulus goes down as I increase the strain. The modulus comes down, actually quite, it's not so much, but comes down. Okay? And we simultaneously measured the volume change. So when you put a viscoelastic material under a deformation, okay, well, all the properties are time dependent. The Poisson's ratio, the bulk modulus, the shear modulus, the extensional modulus, everything's time dependent or frequency dependent. In the linear regime, the V over V0 should just scale like this. This is sort of like the Poisson's effect. So here's 0.01, 0.015, so they're about, right, 50% different, right? And then we go up, so we see things starting to go a little bit faster and faster. And what we see is about 4% that starts going the other way. And at 4.5%, it densifies, just a little bit. But so that's like, we call it implosion, you know. That means it contracted more. So it's denser than it was when we began. Okay. Now, admittedly, I have no real idea why this happens. We can talk about why it might happen. Obviously, I have a material that's out of equilibrium. And in this case, now I've done something. I perturbed it rather strongly. 4.5% is not quite to yield, but it's getting up there. Okay, so I perturbed it quite strongly. And so now the material really does want to recover towards its equilibrium state. Okay, and this might be more like that shear of a colloid that you're seeing, where you really increase the mobility. Okay, so that's what we call implosion. Now this is 100 degrees, 120 degrees below the nominal glass transition in this polycarbonate. The other thing that was interesting was that when we did compression, we couldn't go to as high as strains in compression because we couldn't go to, we would buckle the sample. But what we see is in compression, surprisingly, rather than relaxing back towards no volume change, in compression this material seems to want to get denser. Okay? And again, we don't understand that per se, but it's certainly not the usual type of behavior that people expect from these viscoelastic properties. So now this really does seem to imply that when I'm far below TG and the stresses are higher, when I'm up by TG, the moduli aren't so high, the stresses aren't so high. Here, the stresses are getting much higher, and they apparently are beginning to show signs of actually doing something to the structure of the glass, unlike my original anti-rejuvenation argument, right? So, in fact, Sandy Sternstein might be right. I'm accelerating aging. So and this just shows what the volume looks like as a function of strain for the material that's showing that funny behavior. And this is actually what we had another polycarbonate didn't do that at all. This material would yield and flow. This one would rupture. So there's really some subtleties in behavior. And this just shows the volume versus pressure. So I think just to summarize, I think we know physical aging is related to the structural recovery of the glass. Changes in volume or enthalpy or other internal parameters, i.e. the structure, cause changes in the viscoelastic response. That's what I mean by aging. I presented a detailed argument against the power law elapsed time theory to describe aging in structural glasses, or at least defining its limits, as sort of where we run experiments, of course, and showed in detail how plasticizer jump experiments create glasses that are different from temperature glasses. And then I've discussed rejuvenation and presented results in the subyield regime that seem to contradict the rejuvenation hypothesis, at least when you're close to TG. In the post-yield regime, I've presented results that suggest that yield might cause a polymorphic transition rather than just directly rejuvenating the glass. And I've talked about the implosion event and think maybe that's accelerated aging, and have to acknowledge the people who gave me money and stuff. And I'll be glad to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
So in terms of these last experiments you were showing where it looks like they're going to different steady states.
These?
No, the ones where you had...
this one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so I guess you would expect them to reach the same steady state if they were really under sufficient stress so that you thought they were, in some sense, ergodically sampling some kind of landscape. But here, you're still below yield, right? When
now, these are all these are all
Or these are-
the yield
these
point.
have
This is the
gone
magnitude
beyond
of the
yield.
yield stress. This is the magnitude of the
Magnitude
yield
of the yield
stress,
stress,
right? So in that sense, they're not quite into yield, but it's the magnitude
Right.
of the yield stress. And it suggests that after this sample, I've aged to here, and then I do that shear cycle,
Right.
and I get that point
Uh-huh.
at the same temperature as that point, which
Right,
was
right,
done after temperature quench. And I see that the next point, the aging after that cycle, goes up, and it doesn't go up to there.
So essentially, you could think of this as you're using the yield point as a probe of the structure after the aging.
In this particular
Right.
instance, yeah.
And so in the structure after the aging may not be going to some true steady state. It may be getting stuck in some particular...
Well, if you do an aging experiment here, though, I mean, this would be sort of the equilibrium time, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, okay. It's interesting because in some of the models we look at, if you're below this yield point, then you go to a fixed point, but it's not a unique fixed point to the stress.
Okay.
It's not a unique fixed point. It may depend on the thermomechanical history. And then, but if you're post yield, then you go to some strain rate dependent.
Well, of course,
point.
this is a sample that's post yielded, though.
Right.
This sample is post yielded, but then I use the yield stress to sample that how that evolves. It evolves at sort of the same rate.
But it's post yielded, then it's aged, then it's tested again.
No,
Or-
it's
okay.
post yielded. It's post yielded, and then I treat the end of the yield cycle. I treat that as 0 aging time.
Right.
And now then this is a 1/10 of an hour after
And then
that.
it's aged. Right.
And so this is aging after a thermal treatment.
Right.
I mean, not a stress treatment versus aging after a thermal treatment from above TG to this whatever temperature, TG minus 10. Okay.
Right. So this plateau represents some fixed point you went to due to aging after the first yield.
Yeah, this represents some fixed point we go to after yield, aging after yield. So in other words, this point is different than this,
Right, right.
which is was very surprising to us. Yeah.
Okay.
You have some comments?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of this idea of polymorphism, right? I mean, in some sense, this could be true, but in the sense, if I think of making glasses at different volumes, right? And so you talked about this earlier. Then I have to ask myself, if I now change the volume in the glass, what's going to happen? And even if I same physical volume and the same temperature, what you have is you don't know. So it's not polymorphism in the sense of these liquid-liquid transitions where you have two macroscopic states,
Well,
but it could be many states, and you don't know in what way you're exploring.
Because some people have treated yield as a phase transition, we thought it would be a consistency with that idea. Okay. But don't overinterpret my interpretations, because we wanted to say something that was suggestive, right?
It makes sense. You see that in crystals, that this energy landscape valleys, that what you do will not take it out. Stress would simply homogeneously strain the sample, and if you take this stress out, you come back to the same ground state. So in that sense, the stress and this elasticity is completely reversible. But in glasses, that's not the case because you have so many valleys. So what happens is that no matter how small the stress is, you always take you out to different minima. So that's the inherent sort of viscoelasticity of the system. And if viscoelasticity is fast enough, you come back to the state close to. You'll never come back to the exact state, exactly the same state, but something equivalent to the original state. But if you do something in between, you'll never come back.
Yeah,
and particularly, if you wait long enough in the stress state, you really dig a hole and stay there for a long, long time, right?
But it is interesting. We're only 10 degrees from the TG.
Yeah.
And the aging time is, it's only a few days.
Yeah.
And here, it shows the same kind of behavior.
Yeah,
And
because
the rates are the same, and this was long enough to re-equilibrate this sample after a temperature jump. It's not long enough to re-equilibrate this.
no, the important thing is that yes, I agree with you. But I mean, if you take the stress off, you don't come back to the same state, but landscape look very similar. Right? On the other hand, if you stay in the stress state, then landscape is very different. So for
But
instance,
I'm not in the stress state.
I
here.
understand. No. This case, you come back to the zero state.
Right.
That's why landscape looks similar.
Right.
But the next one, in the implosion, for instance, right?
Yeah.
So, for instance, we can characterize this difference in landscape in terms of bond orientation and isotropy. That's what we did for metallic glasses, and certainly happened for polymers.
Yeah.
You know, you line up the bonds, and you know, you get to the equilibrium state. And actually, it turns out that the bond orientation in polymer and the metallic glass is opposite, but it doesn't matter.
Right.
You
I
just
agree.
dig a hole and stay in that state.
Right.
So in that sense, as Suri said, there are many sort of deep minima depending on the magnitude of the stress. So whenever you change stress, you go from one sort of basin to the other, right? So you get in a big relaxation state. It looks like a phase transition.
Right.
So it makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, are there questions? Yeah.
In this plot, the rate at which you are shearing
It's very slow.
Yeah, is very slow. If you do it at a faster pace, I mean faster strain rate, so does the curve behave in the same manner? Or?
Well, I mean, that is a constant strain rate.
Yeah, I'm telling about 10
If
per
I,
minus.
if I do it at another strain rate,
Yeah, at faster one.
this is the set of experiments we did. This was sort of a unfunded experiment.
Do you expect a shift in this?
Well, if I increase the strain rate, this will go up, for sure, in magnitude, right? Yeah. Right. Yeah. But to the extent that this is just a probe, then they would just move these families up and down as a function of strain rate. Yeah.
Okay, so we take a coffee break now. We come back at 10 minutes to 11.